This video today is to give you an overview of how a hot water boiler works that's fired by oil. So you may have bought a new house that uses oil, or you've never had a boiler before. This will give you a quick overview so that you can learn what the components do, how they work, and some basic things to check in case you're having any problems. So what we're going to do is start with the oil tank. So you obviously have some tank like this in your house. Some houses have them underground, but this is the most common style. This is a 275-gallon tank. It's made of steel. There are plastic ones available on some types of houses and some new construction. These are still by far the most common in North America. So right here I'm zoomed in on the oil gauge, and it's important to know that you really don't want your tank to go empty. In fact, completely empty obviously is a problem because you'll have no heat. But the bigger problem is that you don't want to get down to the very bottom because there can be sludge in the bottom of the tank. So it's generally recommended to keep at least a quarter of a tank of oil. You don't really have to worry about the gallons. You generally want to go by what your gauge says. So there's varying comments about these gauges, and you can see that little red plunger in there. Some folks will tell you it's the bottom of that. Some will say it's the top. Generally, what I have heard is that it's considered to be at the top of that red plunger. So as you can see here, I'm somewhere between 1/2 and 3/4, which is a pretty good spot to be in. But this is the first thing you want to check, obviously, if your heat fails or you're having problems. A lot of heating guys will tell you they have gone out on hundreds of calls where the tank was just out of oil. So it's really important to check that out. Now I'm below the oil tank, and in my house I actually have 2 tanks because I live in somewhat of a remote area. So you will get 2 tanks in houses. I've had a few like this, sometimes larger homes, or if you want to be able to go a lot further between oil fills. But it's really no different whether you have 2 or 1, you just have 2 of certain parts. So in my system here, this is my oil filter, and if you look at the bottom of the tank, you'll see this brass valve right here. And this is what is commonly referred to as a fire-o-matic. These valves are designed for safety so that if there is a fire in your home, this valve will kind of melt inside, and that stops the flow of oil. And if you look at the news or you look back in history, there's not really a lot of house fires based on oil boilers going bad or tanks exploding. There's a lot of safety features built into these, so it's actually quite safe to heat your home with oil, but you do need to keep an eye on it. In my experience, though, as you look around, I have no oil leaks. Now, that's not always the case. A lot of houses will have a drip. You don't have to go crazy about a small drip. Some people will put kitty litter and whatnot, but I'm not really big on leaks, and I would prefer to put a small tray under there. And if you have any sort of a regular drip, you really want to get that looked at by a boiler tech. So the next thing that happens, you have your oil tank. The oil flows through that fire-o-matic into the filter. Doesn't matter if you have this little gauge like I do on top. They're actually not that useful, at least in my opinion. And it flows down this pipe, and you'll see that right here is a special pipe. Now this varies depending what state you're in. So in Massachusetts, we're required to have our oil line encased, and you can see that it's in that blue plastic corrugated housing. That's to protect it. And from there, it actually runs along the floor, and you can see it going through the back. And that little pile of concrete, the oil line is actually encased in. So as we follow the oil line, I'm going to take you with the camera so you can see this. It will come out of the concrete here, and you can see the blue corrugated line, and then ultimately it goes into this device here. And this is your oil burner. That's what it's called. Your oil burner is attached to your boiler, which is obviously the larger unit here. In the United States and most of North America, Beckett burners are easily the most common and most popular. There are other burners such as Riello and some other fancier burners that are foreign made. But if you have a Beckett burner, even if it's really old, this is a good burner to have, because if you're in the middle of the night, you have your heating system break, pretty much anybody in the country, any heating guy can work on this. They're going to have probably parts on their truck. So if you have a Beckett, you're in really good shape. I've had good luck with them over the years. The service is what really makes this burner great. And what is surprising is that these have not changed that much over about 60 years. So my burner has a few extras on it that yours may not, but the most important parts of the burner are the following. I showed you where the fuel line goes in, and that is the copper line here. It goes into a special flared fitting. And this black box on the side is what's called the fuel pump. You don't need to know a lot about that, but you'll also notice that I have another fire-o-matic valve. It's slightly different style, but again, this is designed so if there is a fire, it'll melt inside and stop the flow of oil. You generally would not touch this. If your burner works at all, that means the valve is in the right position. So if you are having a problem, don't just go turning it. That's important to know. Other parts of your burner that you want to know about, and even if you don't have a Beckett, this is still pretty common. This piece on the top is what's called the igniter. There are different versions of these. Some of yours may be a large black box. That's pretty common. But this is the actual device. It's a transformer that turns electrical power into a spark. It's kind of what makes it like a spark plug on a car. And this is what allows the oil to ignite. On the right-hand side of the burner is actually the motor. So what's really clever about these burners, and you don't have to know all this, but it may be useful to you, is that this burner is actually run entirely off of this one motor. And that might not sound like a big deal, but the reason it's very clever is that this motor does a few things. It spins a blower wheel, which is actually inside of this housing right here, and that's what pushes the air into the flow of the fuel so that you can burn oil. But why it's really unique is that this motor not only turns this the motor not only turns this blower wheel inside, but it also turns that fuel pump that I just showed you. So it's pretty clever that they came up with a design that a single motor can do all that. Is this device here. It's always going to be in the upper right hand side on a Beckett. What this is actually what's called the primary control. This is the box that kind of is the brain of this burner, and it's not real complicated. I have a small digital display on mine, which you're not likely going to have on yours, but these vary model to model, year to year. Some of them are very simple, but the important thing to know about is this infamous red button. So if your heating ignition fails, your red button may pop up, or in this case, it might blink like this one would. And when that happens, you can push the button up to 3 times. After that, it's going to go into what they call a lockout. So let me lay the scene for you. It's the middle of the night, your heat fails, you come down, and this guy right here is blinking red. It's okay to go ahead and push it, and usually the system's going to restart, but most often, that isn't really the cause. These things aren't designed to just trip for no reason. Something always causes the burner to trip. And it might get your heat back on for a short amount of time, but it's really not the fix. So when that happens, even if your heat comes on, you're going to want to call a heating person to take a look at it, because that's not a permanent fix. So as we get close to this, you're going to notice this is what they call a tri-indicator. And the reason it's called that is because it tells you multiple things. But the most important thing, the upper part of these typically is going to show you temperature. And you can see that mine's at about 160 right now. And the bottom is pressure. And right now I'm at a little bit less than 20. Some of this is the angle of the camera. But the important thing to know is if you come down to check your heat and the temperature is on 0 and the pressure is on 0, you've got a problem and you've definitely got to call somebody. But this is what a lot of boiler people will use for some basic diagnosis. So this box right here is actually called an Aquastat. So this looks really, really expensive and fancy, and it's really not. It's about $150. This is a Beckett Aquastat. Many of these systems are going to have Honeywell Aquastats. So this, again, is part of the electrical system that controls different devices. But in this particular case, this was about a $150 item for the part alone. This saves me a tremendous amount of money on my heating system. So I had this replaced a while ago. And what this does is it's a little bit smarter than the average Aquastat. It has an outside temperature control. It knows the temp outside. And what this does is it actually helps save me a little bit of oil by sensing the outside temperature, and it figures out how high or low it should set the boiler. So none of this has anything to do with the temperature in your rooms. So if you set your room to 70, 80, or 40, this has nothing to do with it. This has to do with the internal temperature of your boiler, which you can see here is about 160. It's a fairly warm day here today. So even if the heat called, this would probably never go up beyond maybe, in fact, if I zoom over, I can see exactly what it would go beyond. You see there that it says economizing high limit 155. So because the temperature is almost 50 degrees outside today, if this calls for heat, this box is really clever, because what it's going to do is it will not allow, sorry about the focus there. See if I can zoom this in for you. You can see that it says 155. It will not allow the limit of the boiler to go above 155. All that means is these boxes are very important. You should know what your Aquastat is. And if you want to save a little bit of money, it's worth talking to your heating person about potentially installing one of these. This one, again, is called the Beckett AquaSmart. So now you just got to look at what happens when the boiler fires up. Now you always can hear the sound of your boiler, but you may not have known that there really is a flame going on inside, and it's pretty powerful. So as I showed you in that flame shot, that is what is essentially burning the oil, and that oil goes into the upper part of your boiler, and there's a kind of heat exchanger. It's a series of metal pipes and sort of tubes. They even call them nipples, and the water runs through, and it basically absorbs the heat that comes out of that flame that you just saw. So once you've done all that, now we've got to move that hot water to the upper part of your house. And on every boiler, the way that you move water is with a circulator pump. Now, I've done a number of videos about circulator pumps, replacing them, working on them, and even just learning a little bit more about them. So in my system here, I actually have 2 circulator pumps. So when you're looking at a house or anybody talks about heat, they always talk about zones. So zones does not necessarily mean how many circulator pumps you have. So you can have a circulator pump per zone, and some houses do have that, and your average plumber or heat installer will tell you that that generally is the best way. You don't see that done so much anymore because they are expensive. It's a lot of extra plumbing. So more commonly in my house, I have 1 circulator pump that runs all of my heat. And what this does is when the boiler gets hot, after the flame fires, the water actually goes up through the pipes into my house. You see all these pipes up here, I have quite a few of them. And then it returns down, back down this main pipe, and the circulator pump is what moves the water. So as far as a homeowner goes, what you really need to know about a circulator pump is that a circulator pump circulates water, and it's a critical item. So if you ever come downstairs and look in your boiler, maybe you don't have heat or you're having a problem, and you don't hear the circulator pump on or it's making a funny noise, that is a very typical problem. So it's useful to be able to know what the circulator pump is, and that's one right there. Now this one's a little bit high-tech. It's got a display in it. Surprisingly, it doesn't cost as much more than a regular one, but it has some other benefits that are a little bit beyond what this video is, but you just want to know that this is your circulator pump. And in my heating system, I actually have a second circulator pump, not quite so fancy and a little bit smaller, but this circulator pump is, the function for this is it actually moves my domestic hot water. If I zoom out a bit, that's the tank right there. It's a Superstore, and that circulator pump moves the water through that pipe. So that's how the hot water from this boiler gets into my hot water tank. So again, I just said an awful lot, and it's hard to follow along, I think. But the important thing to know is that the circulator pumps are absolutely critical items for your heating system. So it's good to know what they are, where they are, and it's not a bad idea to check them out once in a while so you can get used to the noises that they make, how they look. You never want any water leaks out of these. If you have any water leaks coming on what they call the flanges here, you want to make sure you get some help because that's not normal. But what this is a Taco zone controller. So earlier I mentioned that if you don't have a circulator pump for every zone, and most people don't, you are going to have a controller. And what happens is when your boiler or your room is calling, and that's the word you hear them use a lot, calling just means that your room needs heat. And that triggers a contact, and it has to tell the boiler to start circulating water. So this little electrical box here is your zone control box, and this has the job of taking your thermostats, and it essentially connects it to your boiler. So you may have 8 thermostats in your house, or less, but they're going to connect into here, and then it will control making sure that your heat is on. My advice to you as a homeowner is, if this was working at all and it stopped working, do not start messing with the wires. They can be very confusing. Colors don't really matter. You'll see that I have some other videos on zone control valves. So this is something that best, if it fails, and in my case, this unit has some lights, and it's only on green right now because when it goes red, that means that a room is calling for heat. But if you had lights on it and then there's no lights, that could be a real problem, or electricity could be off. You're going to have one of these transformers somewhere in your heating area. It might be on the wall, it could be somewhere else. The purpose of these is what they do is they actually power your thermostats. So your thermostats are a switch, but you need a little bit of electricity to make them work. So one good tip for you is that if you want to see if these are working, and this is not exactly the most scientific test, but if you touch them, they should be warm to almost hot. If they're ice cold, then you've probably got one that's failed. Another important component to know about is that my dog doesn't like me making a lot of noise underneath where she sits, so I apologize for the dog barking. But when I look up at the ceiling here, you're going to see these are called zone valves, and I've done a number of videos about these because they can be a problem. They're a common item that I wouldn't say it wears out quickly, but they do break over time because, again, remember, your heating system is going to just sit here heating your house for as long as it can before something breaks, and it is normal to have part failures and whatnot. So these zone valves, what they do is each one of these wires are connected to a thermostat. They also go through that zone control box that I just showed you, and each one of these is a room. And if you notice here, it says second parent. I have another one that says first parent. second bedroom. So the naming on these doesn't make any sense. Sometimes the plumber, I swear, does weird stuff, but you want to learn which one of these is what room in your house. So if you are having a heating problem, it's worthwhile to know that one way you can actually eliminate your thermostat, eliminate all that electronics, is if you look closely here, there's a little silver tab, and you actually have a manual override right here. So if you pull this down, and I'm not going to actually do it, but if you pull this down, that's a manual override that'll try to activate that zone's heat. So that's worthwhile to know where that is in case you had a plumber ask you to do this. But I'm trying to explain sort of the system components and give you an idea where things are. The components that are worthwhile to know are these little gold boxes or gold cylinders up here are actually air valves. And on my system, the way it's plumbed, under each one of my zones, or actually above it, I guess, is an air relief valve. And these are designed to let air come out of the system. And these aren't the only way that air gets out of the system. If I go over here a bit, try to give you a shot of this one. I also have a larger valve, and this is above my expansion tank. So this is another valve, but it's important. So above your expansion tank, you're going to have what's usually called an air separator. Yours might be green. That's the Taco version. There's a lot of different ones, but it's worthwhile to know that these are designed to let air out of the system. So if you're in your basement and you hear air hissing and no water's coming out, that is somewhat normal, though you shouldn't hear it all the time, but you may hear it occasionally, and that is normal. Next thing that pretty much everybody is going to have is this weird gray tank. Sometimes they're blue or white. So this is what's called an expansion tank. The point of this is your heating system is a closed system. What that means is there's a certain amount of water in this system. So just like anything, when it gets hot, it expands. If you didn't have this or this tank failed, you're going to have a leak somewhere or you're going to overpressurize your boiler. So this is an important thing. In my case, you'll see that there's a date on the side. A lot of times the installer does that so they know how old these are, because the outside has nothing to do with how beat up it is, though a lot of times you'll have leaks on it. So these expansion tanks are very important. They're not something you can easily test, but one thing you can do if you want to see if it's okay is you can use your finger. And it's a little bit hard to hear that. I'll do it again though. Listen to the difference in sound. So the reason it sounds like that is because the lower part of this tank is actually filled with air just about until that little line, and the upper part should be filled with water. And it bulges out a bit, but if your tank has exactly the same sound from top to bottom, it might have failed. And if you have water leaking out your valves, that could have something to do with this, so this could be something you need to get replaced. Is your boiler has to be supplied with a supply of cold water. And in my case, I have this small valve right here that says boiler. And this is how my water gets into the boiler. Now you might have remembered earlier I said that the boiler is a closed system. So what does that mean? So your water line, in my case, is right here. And it goes into this special backflow preventer is what they call it. And this device is exactly what its name is. It is designed to allow the water to feed into your boiler, but it won't allow water to go backwards. And the reason that's important is because the water inside your boiler is kind of contaminated, it's dirty. You obviously would not want that water getting in your drinking water system. So you have to have a backflow preventer. I can't imagine there's any jurisdiction or state where you don't. And underneath it, you'll see this extra pipe here. And if I follow this down, this pipe goes nowhere. You see there's a little stain there. So it is normal to have a little bit of staining. What it does is, when the water shuts off, it actually, out of the backflow preventer, lets a little bit drip out as it stops it trying to flow backwards. Next component that you're going to have, and this is almost always going to be next to this backflow preventer, is your autofill valve. So the reason it's autofill is because it's automatic. These fail all the time because they sit here for 5 years, 10, 20, 30 years. So this is a very common item that fails. Usually what's going to happen on these is it's not going to stop the water going in the boiler. It might let too much, or you'll have tons of staining. This is a pretty new one, so you'll see that it looks fairly clean. And all you really need to know about this is if you ever needed to add water manually, there's a small little tab here on the top, and when you lift that up, if I put it up in the upright position all the way, it would allow some water to go in. But generally, you're not going to mess with this. It is supposed to be automatic. It's preset to a certain pressure, but you want to know where this is. And again, this is your autofill. Right on the ceiling, you're going to see this weird little device. And this is actually a safety device. If my boiler should ever catch on fire or somehow this flame's coming out of the boiler, This is actually a small heat sensor, and there's a little piece of special metal in here. And what happens is, if the flame reaches it or the heat gets so severe, this little guy can actually, it'll pop out. And what happens is, and I don't recommend that you always do this, but sometimes installers will actually use this as a cutoff switch. When that pops out, all the power is killed to your boiler. So that will also give you another safety factor. If you were to ever have a fire, this can really be a real benefit. You never want to cover this or cause any type of tampering or cause a problem. After you've got oil going into your boiler, you turn it into a flame. That generates heat. The exhaust obviously has to come out. So everybody on any sort of oil heating system is going to have an exhaust pipe. And this is usually something anybody can identify. But what might be a little bit more of a mystery to you is this little item right here. So this is made by a company called Field Controls, and I don't even know that there's any other companies that make these. They probably had the original patent. The purpose of these, and you notice this little door swings, and sometimes people have no idea what they do. They mess around with these little knobs, and that's a weight. But the only purpose of this is it's generally going to be set by your heating contractor, and it has to do with balancing the exhaust. So if you didn't have this, whenever your heating system would run, all the heat would go into the boiler, and the exhaust would go right out. Right up this pipe and then out to your chimney. So the purpose of the Field Controls damper control is what it's called, is that it actually takes a little bit of room air and it mixes it in with the exhaust. And the point of that is that it lets you get a little bit more heat out of your boiler. So this is not something you ever want to put a screw in. I have seen people do all sorts of crazy things. Sometimes they can be a little bit noisy when they open, but if your heat is making a tremendous amount of noise, you want to call for some help on that because that isn't normal. So I hope you found this video helpful. This is really designed for a new homeowner or somebody that's not familiar with oil heat. Oil heat's pretty reliable, it's actually pretty economical, and it's really useful for a homeowner to understand where their components are, what the names of them are, and to take a little bit of the mystery out of it. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, I would really appreciate it if you give me a thumbs up. And also please consider subscribing to my channel. I have a lot of videos about homeowner type items, repairs, and useful things to know. So I really appreciate you watching. I hope you have a great day.